When rancher Gideon Hail bought that cursed cabin for 12 cents, he thought he'd hit rock bottom. But standing at those rusted gates, staring at the body of a young Apache woman swaying in the desert wind with a rope around her neck, he realized his nightmare had just begun. What started as the cheapest land deal in Arizona territory would become the most dangerous fight of his life, a battle against corrupt judges, crooked governors, and men who'd kill to keep their secrets buried. Stay with me until the end of this incredible true story, and comment below what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. Because what Gideon found beneath that cabin floor would shake the very foundations of the American West. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the courthouse steps as Gideon Hail counted the last of his coins. 12 cents. That's all he had left in this world after the drought had claimed his cattle, the bank had taken his ranch, and his wife Sarah had been laid to rest beneath the unforgiving desert soil. The auction hammer was about to fall on the last piece of property available in Copper Creek County, a run-down cabin on 40 acres of scrubland that nobody wanted. "Do I hear 15 cents?" called out auctioneer Murphy, his voice cracking in the heat. The crowd of about 30 men shifted uncomfortably, their boots scraping against the wooden platform. Nobody raised a hand. Murphy's eyes swept across the gathering, landing on weathered faces that looked anywhere but at him. 12 cents going once, Murphy continued, wiping sweat from his brow with a dirty handkerchief. 12 cents going twice? Gideon's hand trembled as he raised it. 12 cents, he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. The crowd turned to stare at him with a mixture of pity and something else. Something that looked uncomfortably like fear. Old Pete Garrison, who'd known Gideon since he was knee-high to a grasshopper, shook his head slowly and spat into the dust. "Son," Pete said quietly, stepping closer, "you don't want that place. Trust me on this." But Gideon had already made up his mind. "I got nowhere else to go, Pete, nowhere else to call home." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension, pawing nervously at the ground and snorting through their nostrils. Murphy looked around one final time, as if hoping anyone would outbid the desperate rancher. "Sold!" Murphy finally announced, his gavel coming down with a hollow thud that seemed to echo longer than it should have. "To Gideon Hail for 12 cents. As the crowd dispersed, men avoided Gideon's eyes and hurried away like they were fleeing a plague. Only Pete remained, his weathered face creased with worry. "Gideon, listen to me," Pete said, grabbing his arm. "That cabin, there's been talk, bad talk. People say things happened there, dark things." "What kind of things?" Gideon asked, though part of him didn't want to know. Pete glanced around nervously, making sure they were alone. "Murder, son, and worse. They say the Apache put a curse on that land after what was done to their people there. Nobody's lived in that cabin for near on 2 years now." Gideon pulled his arm free. "Pete, I appreciate your concern, but curses don't pay for food or put a roof over a man's head. It's just land, just a cabin." "Just a cabin," Pete repeated, shaking his head. "Lord help you, boy. Lord help you." 3 hours later, Gideon sat atop his old wagon, his few remaining possessions rattling in the back, as his mule Jeremiah plodded along the dusty trail toward his new home. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded him too much of blood. The landscape grew more desolate the farther he traveled from town. Sagebrush and tumbleweeds dotted the barren ground, and the only sounds were the creaking of his wagon wheels and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. The isolation was complete, absolute, exactly what a man running from his past might want, if he could afford to be choosy. As the miles passed, Gideon's mind wandered to Sarah. Sweet Sarah, who'd followed him west, with dreams of building something beautiful together. She'd never complain about this place, he thought. She'd find a way to make it home just like she always did. But Sarah was gone now, claimed by the fever that had swept through the territory last winter, and Gideon was left to face whatever came next alone. The trail began to wind upward through a series of low hills covered in scrub oak and manzanita. Jeremiah snorted and slowed his pace as if sensing something ahead that made him nervous. Gideon flicked the reins gently. "Come on, old boy," he murmured, "just a little farther." As they crested the final hill, Gideon's new property spread out before him in the fading daylight. The cabin sat in a small valley surrounded by a weathered wooden fence that had seen better days. Even from this distance, he could see broken rails and sagging posts that would need immediate attention, but it was the gate that made his blood run cold. 2 wooden posts flanked the entrance to the property, connected by a horizontal beam that formed a crude archway. And hanging from that beam, swaying gently in the evening breeze, was the body of a young woman. Gideon's hands went slack on the reins, and Jeremiah came to a stop on his own, pawing nervously at the ground. For a moment, Gideon thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, a shadow, perhaps, or debris caught in the wind. But as he stared, the horrible reality became undeniable. The woman was tall, taller than most men Gideon knew, with long black hair that hung loose around her shoulders. Her feet, bare and dusty, hung several inches above the ground. A crude sign had been nailed to one of the gateposts, its message painted in what looked like dried blood: "Traitor is punishment." "Jesus," Gideon whispered, his voice barely audible. He urged Jeremiah forward, though every instinct screamed at him to turn around and ride back to town. As they drew closer, more details became sickeningly clear. The woman was young, maybe 18 or 19, with the distinctive features of the Apache people. Her clothes, a simple brown dress and leather moccasins, were torn and dirty, as if she'd been dragged before being strung up. But what made Gideon's heart nearly stop was the almost imperceptible rise and fall of her chest. She was still alive. Without thinking, he leaped down from the wagon and ran toward the gate. The rope was thick hemp tied with expert knots that spoke of grim experience. Gideon pulled out his pocket knife and began sawing frantically at the fibers. "Hold on," he said, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. "Hold on, I'm getting you down." The rope parted with a sudden snap, and the woman's weight crashed into Gideon's arms, nearly knocking him to the ground. She was heavier than he'd expected, solid muscle beneath the torn fabric of her dress. He eased her down gently, cradling her head as her eyes fluttered open. They were the most extraordinary eyes he'd ever seen, dark as obsidian, but flecked with gold like captured starlight. They fixed on his face with an intensity that was both grateful and suspicious. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the rope's pressure. "Gideon Hail," he replied, supporting her as she struggled to sit up. "I just bought this place. What's your name? Who did this to you?" "Nayeli," she said, touching her throat gingerly. "My name is Nayeli Whitehawk." The name hit Gideon like a physical blow. Whitehawk. Everyone in the territory knew that name. Chief Whitehawk was one of the most respected and feared Apache leaders, a man who'd negotiated treaties with 3 different territorial governors and commanded the loyalty of hundreds of warriors. "You're Chief Whitehawk's daughter?" Gideon asked. "Granddaughter," Nayeli corrected, trying to stand. Her legs buckled, and Gideon caught her again. "And I am not supposed to be alive. What happened here? Who strung you up?" Nayeli's eyes grew distant, as if she were seeing something far away and terrible. "Men came 3 days ago, white men in fine clothes with silver badges and cold eyes. They said I knew too much, said I had seen things I shouldn't have seen." "What things?" Before Nayeli could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the valley. Gideon looked up to see a group of riders cresting the hill he'd just descended, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Even at this distance, he could see the glint of metal badges, guns, and bridles that caught the last rays of sunlight. "They're coming back," Nayeli whispered, fear creeping into her voice for the first time. "They must have seen the smoke from your wagon." "How many?" Gideon asked, helping her toward the cabin. "5, maybe 6. They're led by a man named Fletcher Knox. He wears a silver-rimmed hat and has eyes like a snake. Gideon had heard of Fletcher Knox, a territorial marshal with a reputation for violence and a badge that seemed to grant him unlimited authority. If Knox was involved in whatever had happened here, Gideon had stumbled into something much bigger and more dangerous than a simple land purchase. "Can you walk?" he asked Nayeli. "I can try." Together they made their way toward the cabin as the riders drew closer. The building was even more run down than it had appeared from a distance. Shingles were missing from the roof, the front porch sagged dangerously, and several windows were boarded up with rough planks. But it was shelter, and right now that was all that mattered. Gideon kicked open the front door, and they stumbled inside. The interior was dark and musty, filled with the smell of abandonment and something else, something metallic and unpleasant, that Gideon didn't want to identify. Dust motes danced in the fading light that filtered through the broken windows. "There," Nayeli said, pointing to a corner where an old rifle leaned against the wall. "The previous owner left that." Gideon grabbed the weapon and checked to see if it was loaded. 3 rounds in the chamber, not much, but better than nothing. Outside, the hoofbeats were getting closer. "Tell me quickly," Gideon said, taking position by the window. "What did you see? What do they think you know?" Nayeli's face was grim in the dim light. "This cabin, this land, it's not what it appears to be. 3 months ago I was hunting near here when I saw men digging beneath the floorboards. White men in expensive suits, not the kind who usually come to places like this. What were they burying? Not burying, taking. There was a metal box hidden under the floor filled with papers. I heard them talking about judges and governors, about land sales and forged deeds. They mentioned my grandfather's name and the names of other chiefs who had signed treaties. The pieces began falling into place in Gideon's mind. They were stealing Apache land. Not just stealing, Nayeli said, legitimizing the theft, making it legal with false documents and bought judges. When they saw me watching, they knew I could expose them. The hoofbeats stopped outside. Gideon peered through a crack in the boarded window and saw 6 men dismounting from their horses. The man in the silver-rimmed hat Knox presumably gestured to his companions, spreading them out around the cabin. "Gideon Hail," Knox called out, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "I know you're in there, and I know you've got the Apache girl. Come out peaceful-like, and we can discuss this like civilized men." Gideon looked at Nayeli, who shook her head emphatically. "He's not here to discuss anything," she whispered. "He's here to finish what he started." "What do you want?" Gideon shouted back. "Just to talk friend. You bought yourself a piece of land today, but I'm afraid there's been a mistake. The territory's prepared to buy it back from you at a considerable profit. Say $500 for your 12-cent investment." $500. It was more money than Gideon had seen in years, enough to start over somewhere far away from Arizona territory and its troubles. But something in Knox's tone, something in the way his men had positioned themselves around the cabin, told him this wasn't really an offer. "And if I'm not interested in selling," Gideon called out. Knox's laugh was cold and humorless. "Well now, friend, I surely hope you are interested. This particular piece of land has a way of being unlucky for its owners. The previous fellow who lived here, for instance, found him face down in the creek with a bullet in his back. Tragic accident, of course." "Of course," Gideon muttered. "You see," Knox continued, "this land contains certain archaeological features that make it valuable to the territorial government. Ancient Apache burial grounds and such. Real sensitive cultural stuff that needs to be protected from private development." "Lies," Nayeli whispered. "There are no burial grounds here. They want the land because of what's hidden beneath the cabin." "So what do you say, Hale?" Knox called. $500 and you can ride out of here a rich man. Hell, you can even take the Apache girl with you if you've taken a shine to her, no questions asked." Gideon's finger tightened on the rifle's trigger. Everything about this situation felt wrong. If Knox really wanted to negotiate, why surround the cabin with armed men? Why offer such an enormous sum for worthless scrubland? And why was he so eager to let Nayeli leave alive when they'd just tried to hang her? "I need some time to think about it," Gideon shouted. "Time's not something we have a lot of, friend. The territorial governor himself is expecting word on this matter before midnight. You understand how important men get when they're kept waiting." The territorial governor. Gideon felt a chill run down his spine. If Governor Marcus Webb was involved in this, then the corruption went all the way to the top of the territorial administration. Webb was known throughout Arizona as a reformer, a man committed to fair treatment of the Apache and honest dealing in land disputes. If he was actually part of a conspiracy to steal tribal lands. 10 minutes, Gideon called out. "Give me 10 minutes to think." 5, Knox replied, "and not 1 second more." As soon as the words left Knox's mouth, Gideon heard the distinctive sound of rifles being cocked. Whatever this negotiation was, it was about to turn deadly. "We need to find that box," Nayeli whispered urgently. "If the papers are still here, they're our only chance of proving what really happened." "Where did you see them digging?" "Near the back corner under what looked like a loose floorboard." Gideon looked around the cabin's interior. The floorboards were rough-hewn planks, darkened with age and wear. But in the back corner he could see scratches in the wood and nails that looked newer than the rest. "Cover the front window," he told Nayeli, handing her a pistol he'd found on a shelf. "If they try to rush us, shoot anyone who comes through that door." "I know how to use it," she said grimly. Gideon moved to the back corner and began prying at the loose boards with his knife. The wood was old and dry, and it didn't take long to work the first plank free. Beneath it was a shallow depression in the earth, recently disturbed. "It's gone," he said, feeling around in the dirt. "Whatever they buried here, they already took it." "No," Nayeli said, her voice tight with concentration as she watched the window. "I saw them take something out, but they were in a hurry. They might have missed something." Gideon continued, digging, his hands growing dirty as he searched the depression. His fingers closed around something hard and rectangular, a small leather journal wrapped in oiled cloth. "Found something," he said, pulling it out. "Time's up, Hail!" Knox's voice boomed from outside. "What's your answer?" Gideon quickly flipped through the journal's pages. It was filled with handwritten notes in several different hands, documenting meetings, payments, and land transfers. Names jumped out at him. Judge William Crane, Territorial Land Commissioner Samuel Ross, and Governor Marcus Webb himself. One entry dated just 2 months ago made his blood run cold. Payment of $50,000 received from Webb for Apache Reservation survey documents. Crane confirms forged deeds will be filed within the week. Ross guarantees no territorial investigation into land transfers. White Hawk and other chiefs to be relocated to New Mexico Reservation once current lands are officially transferred to mining consortium. "My God," Gideon whispered. "They're stealing the entire Apache Reservation." "What?" Nayeli asked, her attention split between the journal and the window. "This journal documents everything. Bribes, forged deeds, plans to force your people off their land so it can be sold to mining companies. Your grandfather and the other chiefs don't know it yet, but their treaties are worthless. The territorial government has already sold their land out from under them." The implications hit both of them at the same time. This wasn't just about one piece of property or even one corrupt official. This was a systematic conspiracy to defraud the Apache Nation of millions of acres of valuable land, orchestrated at the highest levels of territorial government. "Hail!" Knox shouted again. "I'm losing patience." "So am I," Gideon shouted back, his anger finally overcoming his fear. "You can tell Governor Webb that I'm not selling, not for $500, not for $5,000. The silence that followed was ominous. Then Knox's voice came again, colder than before. "I was hoping you'd be reasonable, Hail. Truly I was. Boys, I think we need to conduct a more thorough search of that property. Make sure there are no dangerous Apache hiding out in there. That's our signal to leave, Nayeli said grimly, but before they could move, the shooting started. The first bullet shattered what remained of the front window, spraying glass across the cabin floor. Gideon dove for cover behind an overturned table as more shots followed, punching holes through the thin walls and filling the air with splinters and dust. "Back door!" Nayeli shouted over the gunfire. They scrambled toward the rear of the cabin as bullets whined around them. The back door was stuck swollen with moisture and age. Gideon threw his shoulder against it just as the sound of splintering wood came from the front of the cabin. "They're coming through the front," Nayeli warned, firing 2 quick shots toward the sound. The back door finally gave way and they tumbled out into the gathering darkness. Behind them, boots thundered across the cabin floor as Knox's men searched for their quarry. "This way," Nayeli whispered, pulling Gideon toward a small outcropping of rocks about 50 yards from the cabin. They ran in a crouch, using the darkness and scattered boulders for cover. Behind them, angry voices shouted orders as Knox realized his prey had escaped. "Spread out," he bellowed. "They can't have gone far." Gideon and Nayeli pressed themselves against the cold stone, breathing hard. The journal was still clutched in Gideon's hand, its leather cover slick with sweat. "We have to get this to someone in authority," he whispered. "Someone who isn't part of the conspiracy." "Who?" Nayeli asked. "If the governor and the judges are involved, who can we trust?" It was a good question, and Gideon didn't have a good answer. In his experience, authority in Arizona territory flowed from the territorial capital in Prescott, and if the men in Prescott were corrupt, then there might not be anyone with the power to help them. "The federal marshal in Tucson," he said finally. "He reports directly to Washington, not to the territorial government. That's 2 days' ride from here. Then we better get started." A gunshot rang out uncomfortably close, and rock chips sprayed from the boulder above their heads. Knox's men were getting closer. "There!" one of them shouted. "I saw movement behind those rocks." More shots followed, forcing Gideon and Nayeli to press themselves even flatter against the stone. They were pinned down with nowhere to run, and it was only a matter of time before Knox's men surrounded their position. That's when they heard a sound that made both Knox's men and their quarry freeze in place. It started as a low whistle, almost like wind through the canyon walls, but it grew in volume and pitch until it became unmistakably what it was, a war cry rising from the darkness beyond the cabin. And it wasn't just one voice, it was dozens. "Apache," one of Knox's men said, his voice tight with fear. "Impossible," Knox snapped. "The nearest Apache village is 50 miles from here." But the war cries continued echoing off the valley walls and seeming to come from all directions at once. In the distance, the rhythmic beat of war drums joined the chorus, growing louder and more insistent. "Boss," another voice called out, uncertainty creeping in. "Maybe we should—" "Hold your positions," Knox ordered someone. "It's just a few braves trying to scare us. We've got them outnumbered and outgunned." But Gideon could hear the doubt in Knox's voice. And when the first flaming arrow arced through the darkness to land in the cabin's roof, that doubt turned to alarm. "Nayeli," Gideon whispered, "are those your people?" "I don't know," she replied, but there was hope in her voice for the first time since he'd cut her down from the gate. "My grandfather has scouts throughout this region. If word reached him that I was in danger—" More flaming arrows followed the first, and within minutes the cabin was ablaze. The fire cast dancing shadows across the valley, illuminating the forms of mounted warriors positioned on the surrounding hilltops. Knox's men found themselves in the worst possible tactical position, trapped in a valley with Apache warriors holding the high ground. "Boss," one of Knox's men called out, panic clear in his voice. "We're surrounded." Knox's response was a string of curses that would have made a cavalry sergeant blush. But even his foul language couldn't change the reality of their situation. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and facing an enemy that knew every rock and gully in this territory. "Fall back to the horses," Knox finally ordered. "We'll regroup in town. What about Hale and the girl? Leave them for the Apache. If they're lucky, they'll die quick." But Knox had underestimated both his enemies and his prey. As his men began their retreat, more war cries echoed from the darkness, and this time they were much closer. The first Apache warrior seemed to materialize out of the night itself, appearing behind one of Knox's men with the silence of a shadow. The man's scream was cut short by a knife blade, and he crumpled to the ground without firing a shot. Chaos erupted in the valley. Knox's remaining men fired wildly into the darkness, their muzzle flashes giving away their positions to invisible enemies. Gideon watched in amazement as Apache warriors moved through the night like ghosts, striking and vanishing before their targets could react. "Come," Nayeli said, rising from behind the rocks. "It's safe now." "How can you be sure?" "Because I know that war cry. That's my cousin Joseph Whitehawk, and if he's here, that means my grandfather sent him." They made their way carefully down from the rocks, stepping over the bodies of Knox's men. The marshal himself was nowhere to be seen. Apparently, he'd managed to escape in the confusion, but 4 of his 6 men lay dead in the dust, their weapons scattered around them. A figure emerged from the darkness near the burning cabin. He was tall and lean, with the distinctive features of the Apache people and war paint still fresh on his cheeks. His rifle was held casually in one hand, but his eyes missed nothing as he surveyed the scene. "Cousin," he said to Nayeli in heavily accented English, "grandfather sent me to find you when you did not return from hunting." "Joseph," Nayeli replied, relief evident in her voice. "How did you know where to look?" "Runners brought word from town. They said a white man bought the cursed cabin, and then we heard gunshots. Grandfather feared the worst." Joseph's eyes fixed on Gideon with undisguised suspicion. "This is the white man who bought the land. This is Gideon Hail," Nayeli said. "He saved my life, cut me down from the hanging tree, and protected me from Knox's men." "Knox," Joseph spat. "That one has much Apache blood on his hands." "There's more, Joseph," Nayeli said urgently. "Show him the journal, Gideon." Gideon handed over the leather-bound book, watching as Joseph flipped through its pages. The Apache warrior's expression grew darker with each entry he read. "These names," Joseph said finally, "these are the men who negotiate with our chiefs, the ones who promise fair treaties and honest dealing." "They're stealing your land," Gideon said. "All of it. The entire reservation is being sold to mining companies through forged documents and bribed officials." Joseph was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames of the burning cabin. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of betrayal. "Grandfather must see this. The chiefs must know what these men have planned." "Will they believe it?" Gideon asked. "Will they believe a white man?" "They will believe Nayeli," Joseph replied, "and they will believe this book written in the white man's own hand." As if summoned by his words, more Apache warriors emerged from the darkness. Gideon counted at least a dozen, all mounted and heavily armed. These weren't reservation Indians living under government supervision. These were free Apache men who had never surrendered and never would. "We must go," Joseph said. "Knox escaped, and he will return with more men, many more." "Where?" Gideon asked. "To see Chief Whitehawk," Nayeli replied. "To plan what comes next." "I can't go with you to an Apache camp," Gideon protested. "They'll kill me on sight." "Not if you are under my protection," Joseph said. "And besides, white man, you are already dead if you stay here. Knox will not rest until you and that journal are buried." Gideon looked around at the burning cabin, the bodies of Knox's men, and the vast darkness of the Arizona desert. Joseph was right, there was no going back now. He'd bought more than land for 12 cents. He'd bought himself into a war that had been brewing for decades, a war between those who would steal and those who would fight to keep what was theirs. "All right," he said finally, I'll come with you." "Good," Joseph said, swinging onto his horse, "because whether you know it or not, Gideon Hail, you just became the most important white man in Arizona territory, and the most wanted." As they rode away from the burning cabin into the star-filled desert night, Gideon couldn't help but think about Pete Garrison's warning back in town. The old man had been right about the cabin being cursed, but wrong about who the curse would fall on. It wouldn't be Gideon who suffered for this night's work. It would be every corrupt official from the territorial capital to Washington who had thought they could steal Apache land with impunity. The journal, tucked safely in Gideon's saddlebags, contained enough evidence to bring down governors and judges to expose a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. But first, they had to survive long enough to tell the story, and with Fletcher Knox still alive and undoubtedly gathering reinforcements, that was far from certain. The war for Arizona territory was about to begin, and it had started with a 12-cent land. The ride through the desert night seemed endless, with only the sound of hoofbeats and the distant howl of coyotes breaking the silence. Gideon had never ridden with Apache warriors before, and he found himself both amazed and terrified by their ability to navigate the treacherous terrain in complete darkness. They moved like shadows across the landscape, following paths that were invisible to his untrained eyes. Joseph rode beside him occasionally, pointing out landmarks or warning him of particularly dangerous sections of trail. Despite the circumstances, Gideon found himself grateful for the Apache warriors' guidance. Without it, he would have been hopelessly lost within the first mile. "How much farther?" Gideon asked, after they'd been riding for what felt like hours. "Near," Joseph replied tersely. "Grandfather's camp moves often, but tonight it waits in the old place where the three canyons meet." Nayeli, who had been silent since they'd left the burning cabin, finally spoke up. "Joseph, how many warriors are with Grandfather now?" 200, maybe more. Word has spread among the bands about the white man's broken promises. Many who had gone to the reservation have returned to the free life. Gideon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert air. 200 Apache warriors represented a formidable fighting force, especially on their home ground. If Chief Whitehawk decided to go to war based on the evidence in the journal, the entire territory would be bathed in blood. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thinner and colder. Gideon pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, grateful for the warmth it provided. Around him, the Apache warriors seemed unaffected by the temperature change, their faces impassive as they guided their horses along narrow ledges and through rocky passes. "There," Joseph said, finally pointing toward a distant glow among the rocks, "the sacred fire of our people." As they drew closer, Gideon could make out the shapes of teepees scattered throughout a natural amphitheater formed by towering canyon walls. Smoke rose from numerous cook fires, and the sound of voices carried on the night air. It was larger than any Apache encampment Gideon had ever heard described, a gathering of warriors and families from multiple bands. "Why are there so many?" he asked Joseph. "Because word has already reached them about the government's plans. They know something is coming, even if they don't know exactly what." Guards materialized out of the darkness as they approached the camp's perimeter. Gideon tensed, expecting to be met with hostility, but the sentries simply nodded to Joseph and stepped aside. Apparently, word of their arrival had preceded them. They rode into the heart of the encampment, where a large fire burned in the center of a clearing. Seated around the fire were perhaps a dozen men, their faces painted with the symbols of war chiefs and elder warriors. At their center sat a figure who could only be Chief Whitehawk himself. The old chief was smaller than Gideon had expected, but his presence filled the space around him like a force of nature. His hair was silver white, hanging in long braids decorated with feathers and beads. His face was weathered by decades of sun and wind, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing as he studied the approaching riders. "Grandfather," Nayeli said, dismounting and approaching the fire, "I have returned. My granddaughter." White Hawk replied, his voice carrying the weight of years and wisdom. When you did not come back from hunting, my heart grew heavy. I feared the worst. You were right to fear, grandfather, but I was saved by this man. She gestured toward Gideon, who remained mounted, uncertain of the protocol for meeting an Apache chief. White Hawk's eyes fixed on Gideon with an intensity that made him feel like his soul was being examined. The white man who bought the cursed land for 12 cents. Yes, I have heard this story. Dismount, Gideon Hail. Sit by our fire and tell us what you have learned. Gideon climbed down from his horse, his legs stiff from the long ride. He approached the fire circle, slowly aware that every eye in the camp was upon him. The other chiefs watched him with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Sit, White Hawk commanded, indicating a space beside the fire. Gideon sat cross-legged on the hard ground, trying to ignore the suspicious glances of the warriors around him. Joseph took a position across the fire while Nayeli sat beside her grandfather. Joseph tells me you have something that belongs to the white man's government, White Hawk said, something that reveals their true intentions toward my people. I have a journal, Gideon replied, pulling the leather-bound book from his coat. It documents a conspiracy to steal Apache land through forged documents and bribed officials. Show me. Gideon handed over the journal, watching as White Hawk examined it carefully. The old chief could read English, a fact that surprised many white officials who underestimated Apache intelligence. His face grew darker as he read through the entries, translating key passages for the other chiefs in their native language. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Several of the younger chiefs leaped to their feet, their hands moving to their weapons as angry voices filled the air. Only White Hawk's raised hand prevented the gathering from erupting into chaos. Peace, the old chief said firmly. Anger serves no purpose without understanding. He continued reading, his expression growing more grim with each page. When he finally closed the journal, the silence around the fire was deafening. Gray Wolf, White Hawk said to one of the younger chiefs, ride to the reservation. Bring back Chiefs Running Bear and Stone Crow. They must hear this with their own ears. What of the military post at Fort Apache? Another chief asked. Should we prepare for war? Not yet, White Hawk replied. First, we must understand the full extent of this betrayal. Then we will decide how to respond. He turned back to Gideon, his weathered face grave in the firelight. You have brought us dangerous knowledge, white man. Knowledge that could start a war that will consume this entire territory. I brought you the truth, Gideon replied. What you do with it is your choice. Truth, White Hawk repeated as if tasting the word. Yes, that is what you have brought us, but truth and justice are not the same thing. Truth tells us what has been done. Justice tells us what we must do in return. Grandfather, Nayeli spoke up. There is more. Gideon saved my life when Knox's men left me to hang. He could have taken their offer of money and walked away, but he chose to fight beside me instead. White Hawk studied Gideon with renewed interest. Why risk your life for an Apache woman you had never met? It was a question Gideon had been asking himself since the moment he'd cut Nayeli down from the gate. Why had he gotten involved? Why hadn't he just taken Knox's money and disappeared? Because it was the right thing to do, he said finally, because nobody deserves to hang for telling the truth. Even an Apache woman, even knowing that helping her would make you an enemy of powerful white men, especially then. White Hawk was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving Gideon's face. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of decision. You have proven yourself worthy of trust, Gideon Hail. But trust is a dangerous thing in times like these. Tell me, what do you think should be done with this knowledge? Gideon considered the question carefully. He was walking a tightrope here, balanced between two worlds that were rapidly moving toward war. Whatever he said next could determine whether that war started tomorrow or might still be prevented. I think it should be presented to someone in federal authority, he said. Someone who isn't part of the territorial conspiracy. a federal judge or a marshal who reports directly to Washington. And if no such person exists, if the corruption reaches even to your nation's capital, then, Gideon paused, realizing the implications of what he was about to say, then you have the right to defend your people by any means necessary. A murmur ran through the circle of chiefs, and Gideon saw several nods of approval, but White Hawk's expression remained unreadable. Dangerous words from a white man, the old chief said, words that could be seen as encouraging Apache to make war against the United States government. I'm not encouraging anything, Gideon replied. I'm just saying that people have the right to protect themselves when their government betrays them. Even if those people are Apache, especially if they're Apache. You've been betrayed before and you'll be betrayed again unless someone stands up to these corrupt officials. White Hawk leaned back, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Joseph, bring the talking stick. We will hear from all the chiefs before we decide our path. What followed was unlike anything Gideon had ever witnessed. For the next 2 hours, chief after chief stood to speak their voices, carrying the pain and anger of generations of broken promises. Some spoke in English for Gideon's benefit, others in Apache with Joseph providing translation. Chief Red Eagle, a man whose scars spoke of many battles, argued for immediate war. How many treaties must be broken before we admit that the white man's word is worthless? How many times must we be driven from our homes before we say no more? Chief Morningstar, older and more cautious, counseled patience. War will bring death to our people. Our children will suffer for our anger. Perhaps there is still a way to seek justice through the white man's courts. Chief Thunderhorse, who had lost 2 sons in previous conflicts with the military, spoke with quiet intensity. My boys died believing that peace was possible, that their sacrifice would buy safety for future generations. Now I learn that while they lay dying, these same officials were already planning to steal what little land we had left. The debate continued deep into the night with passionate arguments on all sides. Gideon found himself moved by the eloquence and wisdom of these men who were discussing the fate of their entire people with a gravity that matched the moment. Finally, Chief White Hawk himself took the talking stick. The old leader stood slowly, his age showing in the careful way he moved, but his voice was strong and clear. My brothers, he began, I have lived through more betrayals than any man should have to witness. I have watched our people driven from their ancestral homes, forced onto reservations, promised food and supplies that never came. I have buried warriors who died defending land that was rightfully ours, only to see that same land sold to white settlers the next year. He paused, looking around the circle of faces. But I have also seen what war costs us. I have held dying children in my arms, children who knew nothing of politics or treaties, but paid the price for our conflicts with their lives. Gideon felt the weight of the moment, understanding that he was witnessing a turning point in the history of the Apache people. This journal, White Hawk continued, holding up the leather-bound book, proves what we have long suspected. The territorial government has no intention of honoring any treaty or agreement with our people. They see us only as obstacles to be removed by legal theft, if possible, by force if necessary. Then we must fight, Chief Red Eagle interjected, but White Hawk raised his hand for silence. Yes, we must fight, but we must fight smart. If we simply take up arms and attack the nearest military post, we will be branded as savage rebels, and all the might of the United States Army will descend upon us. Our people will be hunted down and killed or imprisoned, and the world will be told that we brought it upon ourselves. Then what do you propose, grandfather? Chief Morningstar asked. White Hawk's eyes found Gideon across the fire. We will give the white man's justice one chance to work. We will take this evidence to federal authorities and demand action against the corrupt officials, but we will not do it as supplicants begging for mercy. How then? We will do it as a sovereign nation demanding justice for crimes committed against our people And if that justice is denied, White Hawk's voice grew hard as flint, then we will take it for ourselves. The implications of his words hung heavy in the night air. The Apache were preparing for war, but they were also offering the federal government one last chance to avoid it. Gideon Hail, White Hawk said, turning to face him directly. You have brought us this knowledge and you have proven yourself trustworthy. Will you carry our message to the federal authorities? Gideon felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. What White Hawk was proposing was dangerous beyond measure. If he agreed, he would be acting as an Apache envoy to the federal government, a role that could be seen as treason by territorial authorities. What would you want me to tell them? He asked. The truth, that the Apache Nation has proof of territorial corruption and demands federal intervention, that we seek justice through legal means but will defend ourselves if justice is denied. And if they don't listen, if they're part of the conspiracy too. White Hawk's smile was grim. Then you will have your answer about the white man's justice, and we will have ours. Gideon looked around the circle of faces, seeing determination mixed with resignation. These men were preparing to risk everything on the slim hope that somewhere in the federal government honest men still existed. I'll do it, he said finally, but I want something in return. Name it. Safe passage for any Apache who want to avoid the coming war. Women, children, old people who don't want to fight. Promise me they'll be protected regardless of what happens. White Hawk nodded slowly. You think like a Chief Gideon Hail. Yes, the innocent will be protected, but understand this, if war comes, it will not be limited to warriors and soldiers. The territorial government has shown us that they make no distinction between combatants and civilians. We cannot tie our hands if they do not tie theirs. Fair enough. Then it is decided. You will leave at first light for Tucson, carrying our message to Federal Marshal James Crawford. He has a reputation for honesty, though whether that extends to dealing with Apache remains to be seen. What about Knox? He's still out there, and he knows I have the journal. Knox is no longer your greatest concern, Chief Thunderhorse spoke up. By now he has reported back to his superiors. They know the journal has been found, and they know you are alive to tell about it. Every territorial official involved in this conspiracy will be hunting you. All the more reason to move quickly, White Hawk said. Joseph will escort you as far as the territorial road. After that, you travel alone. Why alone? Because a white man traveling with Apache warriors would attract attention we cannot afford. You must appear to be simply a citizen seeking justice, not an Apache ally making demands. Gideon understood the logic even if he didn't like it. Traveling alone through hostile territory with evidence that could topple the territorial government was tantamount to suicide, but it was the only way to maintain the illusion of neutrality. There's something else, Nayeli said, speaking for the first time since the debate had begun. The journal mentions specific dates for upcoming land transfers. If we're going to stop this conspiracy, we have to act before those dates pass. White Hawk looked at her with interest. What dates? She recited several entries from memory, having studied the journal carefully during their ride to the camp. 3 days from now, Judge Crane is scheduled to file forged deeds for the eastern section of the reservation. A week after that, Commissioner Ross will authorize the transfer of mineral rights to the mining consortium. Then we have very little time, White Hawk said grimly. Gideon, you must reach Marshal Crawford within 2 days. Can it be done? If I kill my horse doing it, yes. Good. But first, you must rest. Dawn will come soon enough, and you have a long journey ahead. As the council dispersed, Gideon found himself alone by the dying fire with Nayeli and Joseph. The Apache warrior studied him with curious eyes. You surprise me, white man, Joseph said. Most of your people would have taken Knox money and disappeared. Most of your people would have killed me on sight, Gideon replied. I guess we both have our surprises. Naeli laughed, a sound that seemed strange after the serious tone of the council. Joseph, he's not like the others. When he found me hanging at that gate, he could have left me there. No one would have blamed a white man for not wanting to get involved with Apache troubles. Maybe, Joseph said, but now he is involved whether he wants to be or not. Knox will not rest until both of you are dead. Let him come, Gideon said, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. I've lost everything else, my ranch, my cattle, my wife, but I still have my integrity, and that's something Knox can't take from me. Joseph nodded approvingly. Spoken like a warrior, but remember, integrity won't stop a bullet. You must be very careful on this journey. I know. Do you really? Naeli's voice was soft but serious. Gideon, these men have already killed to protect their secret. They won't hesitate to kill again. Then I better make sure they don't catch me. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last embers of the fire die down to glowing coals. Around them the camp was settling in for what remained of the night, though Gideon could see sentries posted at strategic points throughout the canyon. Naeli, he said finally, what will you do if this doesn't work? If the federal marshal won't listen, or if he's part of the conspiracy too? She was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of generational pain. Then I will fight, she said simply. I will fight beside my grandfather and my cousins, and I will die as a free Apache rather than live as a slave on someone else's land. Even knowing what war will cost your people, especially knowing what it will cost, because some things are worth dying for, Gideon. Freedom is one of them. Justice is another. Joseph stood up, stretching his muscles after the long council session. You should sleep, white man. Tomorrow's ride will be hard, and you'll need all your strength. What about you two? We keep watch, Joseph replied. Knox may be gathering reinforcements even now. If he attacks this camp, we must be ready. The thought of Knox returning with a larger force was sobering. Gideon had seen what the marshal was capable of, and he had no doubt the man would be seeking revenge for the humiliation he'd suffered at the burning cabin. How many men could he bring? Gideon asked. Depends on how many he can trust with the truth, Naeli replied. If this conspiracy is as widespread as the journal suggests, he might have access to territorial militia as well as federal marshals. Then why haven't they attacked already? Because they don't know where we are, Joseph said, and because attacking an Apache war camp is not something any sane man undertakes lightly, even with superior numbers. Gideon lay down on a blanket that had been provided for him, using his saddle as a pillow. Above him, the desert stars shone with a clarity that was impossible to see in populated areas. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, beautiful and eternal. As he drifted toward sleep, his mind wandered to Sarah. What would she think of all this? Would she approve of his decision to get involved in Apache politics, or would she think he was being foolishly idealistic? He thought he knew the answer. Sarah had always believed in doing what was right, regardless of the personal cost. She would have been proud of him for cutting Naeli down from that gate, and she would have supported his decision to carry the Apache message to federal authorities. Don't worry, Sarah, he whispered to the stars. I'm going to see this through no matter what it costs me. The last thing he remembered before sleep took him was the sound of Apache lullabies being sung quietly around the camp mothers, comforting their children in a language that was older than any white settlement in the territory. It was a reminder that whatever happened in the coming days, real people would pay the price, not just politicians and conspirators, but families who wanted nothing more than to live in peace on the land of their ancestors. Dawn came too soon, painting the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold that reminded Gideon painfully of Sarah's morning smile. He woke to find Joseph already saddling fresh horses, his movements efficient and silent in the pre-dawn light. Time to go, white man, the Apache warrior said quietly. The sun rises and your enemies do not sleep. Gideon rolled up his blanket and secured it to his saddle, his body aching from the hard ground and short rest. Around the camp, Apache families were beginning their morning routines, but he noticed that many of the warriors were conspicuously absent. They had melted away into the desert before dawn, taking positions to watch for Knox's return. Chief Whitehawk approached as Gideon finished preparing his horse. The old leader looked as if he hadn't slept at all, his weathered face etched with the weight of the decision they'd made. "Here," Whitehawk said, handing Gideon a small leather pouch. "Medicine for the journey. It will keep you alert when exhaustion threatens to claim you." "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet. What you carry may be your death warrant, but it may also be the salvation of two peoples who have forgotten how to trust each other." Nayeli emerged from one of the teepees carrying a rifle and ammunition. "I'm coming with you," she announced. "No," Gideon said immediately. "It's too dangerous. If Knox catches us together, Knox wants me dead whether I'm with you or not," she interrupted. "At least, this way I can fight back." Joseph shook his head. "Nayeli grandfather said the white man travels alone. It is the only way." "Grandfather also said we must be smart about how we fight," she retorted. "Gideon knows the white man's world, but he doesn't know this territory. He'll be lost or dead before he reaches the territorial road without a guide." The argument was interrupted by the arrival of a scout. His horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. He spoke rapidly to Joseph in Apache, his words carrying an urgency that needed no translation. "What is it?" Gideon asked. Joseph's face was grim. "Knox has returned to Copper Creek. He's gathering men, territorial militia, federal marshals, even some cavalry from Fort Apache. The scout counted at least 50 riders." 50. Gideon felt his stomach drop. "How is that possible?" "Because Judge Crane has issued federal warrants for our arrest," Whitehawk said, his voice heavy with bitter understanding. "We are now officially wanted for murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy against the territorial government. Based on what evidence? Knox's word, apparently. He claims we killed his men in an unprovoked attack and kidnapped you against your will." The twisted logic was brilliant in its simplicity. By making Gideon appear to be a victim rather than a willing participant, the conspiracy had turned the Apache into the aggressors and themselves into the injured parties seeking justice. "They're moving fast," the scout continued in broken English. "Maybe 6 hours behind our trail." "Then we leave now," Joseph decided. "All of us. The camp must be moved to the winter grounds in the high country." Whitehawk nodded slowly. "And our messenger goes with Nayeli, as she suggested. She knows paths that no white tracker can follow. If anyone can get him to Tucson alive, it's my cousin." There was no time for further argument. Within minutes, the entire camp was in motion, with the practiced efficiency of people who had been forced to flee many times before. Teepees came down, possessions were packed, and children were bundled onto travois with swift, silent precision. Gideon found himself mounted on a fresh horse, the precious journal secured in his saddlebags, alongside ammunition and supplies for the journey. Nayeli rode beside him on a paint mare, her rifle across her saddle, and her dark eyes scanning the horizon for threats. "This way," she said, pointing toward a narrow defile between towering rock walls. "We go through Devil's Backbone. No white man would dare follow that trail." "Why not?" "Because it's haunted," Joseph said with a grim smile, "and because one misstep sends you 1,000 feet down onto the rocks below." They rode hard for the first hour, putting distance between themselves and the camp, as the sun climbed higher into the cloudless sky. The trail Nayeli chose was treacherous, a narrow ledge carved into the face of a cliff that seemed to drop away into infinity on one side. Gideon tried not to look down as his horse picked its way carefully along the precipice. Below them, buzzards circled lazily over the canyon floor, riding the thermals that rose from the sun-baked rocks. One stumble, one moment of inattention, and he would join whatever they were waiting for. "How much farther through this pass?" he called to Nayeli. 2 more hours if we're lucky, but this is the easy part. Easy. Wait until we reach the ladder. The ladder, as it turned out, was a series of natural rock formations that formed a crude stairway down the far side of the cliff. It had been carved wider by Apache hands over generations, but it was still barely wide enough for a horse and rider. They dismounted and led their animals down the treacherous descent, every step sending loose stones clattering into the abyss below. "Your people built this?" Gideon asked, pausing to catch his breath halfway down. "My great-grandfather's people," Nayeli replied. "When the Spanish first came to this land, they needed places to hide, places where horses and metal armor were more burden than advantage. And it worked, for a while, until the Spanish learned to starve us out instead of trying to chase us into places like this." When they finally reached the bottom of the canyon, Gideon's legs were shaking from the strain, and his shirt was soaked with sweat despite the morning chill. But they had gained precious time. No pursuing force could follow their trail through Devil's Backbone without suffering heavy casualties, and Knox would have to find another route if he wanted to intercept them. They remounted and continued across the canyon floor, following a dry stream bed that wound between towering walls of red sandstone. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their horses' hooves on the rocky ground and the occasional cry of a hawk overhead. "Tell me about Marshal Crawford," Nayeli said as they rode. "Can he be trusted?" "I've never met him personally," Gideon admitted, "but his reputation is solid. He's been federal marshal for the Southern District for 8 years, and I've never heard his name connected to any corruption scandals." "That doesn't mean he's not part of this conspiracy." "No, but it's the best chance we have. If we can't trust him, then there's probably no one in territorial authority we can trust." They rode in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Gideon found himself thinking about the magnitude of what they were attempting. They were 2 people carrying evidence that could topple the entire territorial government, being pursued by 50 armed men who had legal authority to kill them on sight. The odds were not encouraging. "Nayeli," he said finally, "why are you really coming with me? And don't say it's just because I need a guide. Your grandfather has guides who know this territory better than anyone." She was quiet for so long that he thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible over the sound of their horses. "Because this is my fault," she said. "If I hadn't been watching that cabin, if I hadn't seen what I saw, none of this would be happening. You can't blame yourself for discovering the truth." "Can't I? How many people are going to die because of what I witnessed? How many Apache children will lose their fathers in the war that's coming?" Gideon reined in his horse, forcing her to stop as well. "Listen to me. You didn't cause this conspiracy. You didn't create the corruption that's stealing your people's land. All you did was refuse to let them bury the truth. Tell that to the mothers who will mourn their sons. I'll tell them that their sons died fighting for justice instead of accepting slavery. That's something to be proud of, not ashamed of." Nayeli's eyes flashed with anger. Easy words from a white man who's never had to watch his people slowly destroyed by broken promises and stolen land. "You're right," Gideon said quietly. "I can't understand what your people have endured, but I can understand what it means to fight for what's right, even when the cost is too high to bear." "Can you? What have you ever lost fighting for justice?" The question hit him like a physical blow. What had he lost? His ranch, his cattle, his comfortable life, all taken by economic forces beyond his control, not sacrificed for any noble cause. He'd been a passive victim of circumstance, not a warrior fighting for principle. "Nothing," he admitted. "I've lost everything, but not fighting for anything that mattered. Maybe that's why I'm here now. Maybe this is my chance to finally stand for something worth the price." Nayeli studied his face for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. "You really believe that, don't you? That this matters enough to die for, don't you?" "I have to. If I don't believe it matters, then I'm just leading us both to meaningless deaths in the desert." They resumed riding, but the conversation had changed something between them. The desperate nature of their mission seemed to create a bond that transcended their different backgrounds and the short time they'd known each other. As the sun reached its zenith, the heat became almost unbearable. They stopped in the shade of a massive boulder to rest their horses and share some of the water from their canteens. Gideon was beginning to understand why the Apache were such formidable fighters in this terrain. The desert itself was their ally, testing the endurance and determination of anyone who dared to challenge them on their home ground. "How much farther to the territorial road?" he asked. "6 hours, maybe 7, but we'll have to be careful when we get close. Knox might have men watching the main routes." "What's our backup plan if the road is blocked?" "We don't have one. The territorial road is the only way to reach Tucson in time. If it's blocked, we'll have to fight our way through or die trying." The bleak certainty in her voice sent a chill down Gideon's spine. She wasn't speaking hypothetically about fighting and dying. She was stating facts as she saw them. For her, this mission was quite literally a matter of life and death for her entire people. They were preparing to resume their journey when Nayeli suddenly held up her hand for silence. In the distance, almost beyond the range of hearing, came the faint sound of hoofbeats, echoing off the canyon walls. "How many?" Gideon whispered. Nayeli closed her eyes, concentrating on the sound. "At least a dozen, maybe more. They're moving fast, but they're still hours behind us." "Knox's advance party." "Probably. He'd send his best trackers ahead to find our trail, while the main force follows more slowly." They mounted quickly and spurred their horses into a faster pace. The race was on now with no margin for error or rest. If Knox's trackers could follow their path through Devil's Backbone, which seemed impossible but couldn't be ruled out entirely, then their lead was evaporating rapidly. The terrain began to change as they climbed out of the canyon system toward higher ground. Scrub brush gave way to pinon pines and mountain mahogany, and the air grew cooler and thinner. In the distance, Gideon could see the snow-capped peaks of the Rincon Mountains, beautiful and remote. "There," Nayeli said, pointing toward a gap between two ridges. "The territorial road runs through that pass. Once we reach it, it's a straight shot to Tucson. And if Knox has men waiting for us there, then we find out how good we are at fighting outnumbered." As they approached the pass, Nayeli began moving with increased caution, studying the terrain ahead for signs of ambush. She led them off the main trail onto a game path that paralleled their intended route, using the cover of trees, trees and boulders to mask their approach. The territorial road, when they finally reached it, was empty in both directions. It was a dusty track wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, cutting through the mountains like a scar across the landscape. To Gideon, it represented civilization and safety. To Nayeli, it clearly represented exposure and danger. "We'll be visible for miles once we're on that road," she said. "And we'll be trapped if they catch us in open country. But it's also the fastest way to Tucson. How long by the road? 6 hours of hard riding, maybe 5 if we kill our horses doing it." They studied the empty road for several minutes, weighing their options. Finally, Gideon made the decision for both of them. "We take the road. Speed is more important than stealth now. If Knox is going to catch us, at least let's make him work for it." They spurred their horses down onto the road and immediately broke into a gallop. The risk was enormous. They were now completely exposed to anyone watching from the surrounding hills, but their horses could make much better time on the well-maintained surface than on the rocky mountain trails. For the first hour, the road remained empty except for their own dust cloud. Gideon began to hope that they might actually make it to Tucson without incident. But as they crested a hill that gave them a view of several miles of road ahead, his heart sank. In the distance, barely visible through the heat shimmer, a group of riders was approaching from the direction of Tucson. They were too far away to count accurately, but there were definitely more than a dozen men. "Knox?" Gideon asked. Nayeli shaded her eyes against the sun, studying the distant figures. No, those are cavalry uniforms. Knox must have sent word ahead to intercept us from both directions. They were trapped. Knox's trackers were somewhere behind them, and now Federal cavalry was approaching from ahead. The territorial road had become a killing ground, with them caught in the middle. "Off the road," Nayeli said urgently. "There's a side canyon about a mile ahead. We might be able to hide until they pass." But even as she spoke, they could see that the cavalry had spotted them. The distant riders broke into a gallop, their horses kicking up a cloud of dust that marked their position like a signal fire. "Too late," Gideon said grimly. "They've seen us." "Then we run. It's our only chance." They pushed their horses harder, racing toward the side canyon Nayeli had mentioned. Behind them, the sound of pursuing hoofbeats grew louder as the cavalry closed the distance. Ahead, the mouth of the canyon appeared as a dark slash in the canyon wall, offering the promise of cover if they could reach it in time. The cavalry was gaining ground rapidly. Their horses were fresh, while Gideon and Nayeli's mounts were beginning to show the effects of their long journey. Foam flecked their animals' muzzles, and their breathing was becoming labored. "There," Nayeli shouted, pointing toward the canyon entrance. 500 yards. A rifle shot cracked across the desert, and a bullet whined past Gideon's ear. The cavalry was close enough to take aimed shots, though the distance and their own movement made accuracy difficult. More shots followed, and Gideon heard his horse grunt as a bullet creased its flank. The animal stumbled but kept running, driven by its own terror and the desperate urgency of its rider. They reached the canyon entrance just as the cavalry rounded the bend behind them. Nayeli led them into the narrow opening between towering walls of red rock, where the sound of hoofbeats echoed and amplified until it seemed like an army was pursuing them. "This way," she called, taking a sharp turn to the left that led deeper into the canyon system. The pursuit continued through the twisting passages, with shots echoing off the walls and ricocheting unpredictably. But the narrow confines that made the gunfire so terrifying also worked in their favor. The cavalry couldn't spread out or use their superior numbers effectively in the confined space. After several minutes of frantic riding, Nayeli led them up a steep side canyon that ended in a box canyon surrounded by nearly vertical walls. To Gideon, it looked like a trap with no escape route. "Dead end," he called to her. "No," she replied, pointing toward what looked like solid rock face. "There's a hidden passage. The Apache have used this place for generations." What had appeared to be a solid wall was actually a narrow crack in the rock, barely wide enough for a horse and rider. They squeezed through the opening just as their pursuers reached the box canyon behind them. On the other side of the crack, they found themselves in a hidden valley, perhaps a mile long and half a mile wide. It was invisible from the outside, completely enclosed by towering cliffs that would be impossible to climb. "How do we get out?" Gideon asked. "There's another passage at the far end. It leads back to the territorial road about 10 miles closer to Tucson." Behind them, they could hear the cavalry searching the box canyon, their frustrated voices echoing off the walls as they tried to figure out where their quarry had disappeared. "They'll find the entrance eventually," Nayeli said. "We need to keep moving." They rode across the hidden valley at a more sustainable pace, giving their exhausted horses a chance to recover. The grass was rich and green here, fed by a small spring that emerged from the rocks near the center of the valley. It was a peaceful place, unmarked by the conflicts that raged in the outside world. "How many people know about this place?" Gideon asked. "Very few. It's been kept secret for over 100 years, a place where Apache families could hide when the wars came. And you're trusting me with that secret. I'm trusting you with more than that. I'm trusting you with the future of my people." The weight of that trust settled on Gideon's shoulders like a physical burden. Everything depended on his ability to reach Marshal Crawford and convince him to act on the evidence in the journal. If he failed, the consequences would be measured in Apache blood. The passage at the far end of the valley was even narrower than the first, requiring them to dismount and lead their horses through on foot. When they emerged on the other side, they found themselves back on the territorial road, with Tucson still several hours ahead. "The cavalry will have to backtrack to find us," Nayeli said. "We've bought ourselves maybe an hour. And Knox's trackers, still behind us if they manage to follow our trail at all. We might actually make it." They remounted and resumed their race toward Tucson, but both of them knew that their most dangerous moments lay ahead. If word had reached the territorial capital about their mission, every law enforcement officer between here and Mexico would be looking for them. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of orange and red, Gideon found himself thinking about the chain of events that had brought him to this moment. 3 days ago, he had been a broken man with nothing left to lose. Now he was carrying the hopes of an entire people toward an uncertain future. "Nayeli," he said as they rode, "whatever happens in Tucson, I want you to know something. Meeting you, learning about this conspiracy, fighting beside your people, it's given my life meaning again. For the first time since Sarah died, I feel like I'm doing something that matters." "Don't talk like we're about to die," she replied. "We're going to reach Marshal Crawford, and he's going to listen to us, and justice is going to be done." "You really believe that?" "I have to believe it, because if I don't, then all of this suffering has been for nothing." The lights of Tucson appeared on the horizon just as the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, and Gideon felt a mixture of hope and dread settle in his chest. They had made it this far against impossible odds, but the most dangerous part of their journey was just beginning. In those precious final miles before Tucson, with darkness settling over the desert like a protective blanket, Gideon and Nayeli pushed their exhausted horses through the outskirts of the territorial capital. The town sprawled before them like a constellation of flickering lights, each window representing safety or danger depending on who waited behind it. "The federal courthouse is on Congress Street," Gideon said, his voice hoarse from dust and exhaustion. "Crawford's office will be there, but at this hour, he'll be at home," Nayeli finished. "Do you know where he lives?" "No, but someone at the courthouse will. There's usually a night clerk for emergencies." They rode cautiously through the dusty streets, keeping to the shadows and avoiding the main thoroughfares where territorial marshals might be watching. Tucson at night was a different creature than during the day. Saloons spilled light and laughter onto the boardwalks, while in the darker alleys, men conducted business that couldn't bear scrutiny in daylight. The federal courthouse stood like a monument to justice on the corner of Congress, and Church Street's its imposing stone facade speaking of permanence and authority. But as they approached, Gideon's heart sank. The building was dark except for a single light burning in a ground-floor window. "There," he said, pointing to the illuminated window. "Someone's there." They tied their horses to a hitching post and approached the building cautiously. Through the window they could see an elderly clerk working by lamplight, his gray head bent over a stack of papers. Gideon knocked on the glass, causing the old man to look up with startled eyes. For a moment the clerk seemed ready to ignore them, but something in Gideon's desperate expression must have convinced him to investigate. "We're closed," the clerk said through the partially opened door. "Federal business hours are 8 to 5 Monday through Friday." "This is an emergency," Gideon replied urgently. "I need to speak with Marshal Crawford immediately. Lives depend on it." The clerk's eyes narrowed as he took in their dust-covered clothes and exhausted appearance. "What kind of emergency?" "A territorial conspiracy involving stolen Apache land and forged government documents. I have evidence that needs to reach federal authorities tonight." "Evidence of what exactly?" Gideon looked around, nervously aware that every moment they spent in the open increased their risk of being spotted. "Look, I can't explain everything standing here on the street. Please just tell me where I can find Marshal Crawford." The clerk studied them for a long moment, his weathered face skeptical. "You carrying weapons?" "Yes, but leave them outside, both of you." Gideon and Naeli reluctantly placed their rifles and pistols on the ground beside the door. The clerk opened it wider, allowing them to enter. "Now," he said, closing and locking the door behind them. "Start from the beginning and make it convincing, because if you're wasting my time, I'll have you both in jail before midnight." For the next 10 minutes, Gideon laid out the entire story: the 12-cent land purchase, finding Naeli hanging at the gate, the discovery of the journal, their flight from Knox and his men. The clerk listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. "You have this journal with you?" he asked when Gideon finished. Gideon pulled the leather-bound book from his saddlebags and handed it over. The clerk opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the entries with the practiced attention of someone who knew what to look for in legal documents. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered after reading several pages. "If this is authentic." "It's authentic," Naeli said firmly. "I saw them take it from beneath the cabin floor myself." The clerk looked up at her, seeming to notice her Apache features for the first time. "You're the Indian woman they're looking for. There's been telegrams coming in all day about you." "What kind of telegrams?" Gideon asked. "Federal warrants. Judge Crane issued them this afternoon. You're both wanted for murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy against the territorial government." "That's exactly what we expected," Gideon said grimly. "They're trying to discredit us before we can present our evidence." The clerk closed the journal and looked at them both with troubled eyes. "This puts me in a difficult position. I have a duty to uphold federal law, including executing valid warrants. Even when those warrants are issued by corrupt judges to cover up their own crimes, that's not for me to decide. That's for Marshal Crawford to determine." "Then take us to him," Naeli said. "Let him make that decision." The clerk was quiet for a long moment, clearly torn between his duty and his conscience. Finally, he reached for his coat hanging on a nearby peg. "Marshal Crawford lives on Meyer Street, about 6 blocks from here. But I warn you, if this journal turns out to be forged, or if your story doesn't hold up under scrutiny, I'll personally deliver you to the territorial marshals myself." "Fair enough," Gideon said. They retrieved their weapons and followed the clerk through Tucson's quiet streets. Most of the businesses were closed for the night, but saloons and gambling halls still showed signs of life. Music and laughter drifted from behind closed doors, creating a surreal contrast to the deadly serious nature of their mission. Marshal Crawford's house was a modest adobe structure with a small garden in front and a stable behind. Light showed through the curtained windows, suggesting the federal marshal was still awake despite the late hour. The clerk knocked on the front door, and after a moment, it opened to reveal a tall, lean man in his 50s, with graying hair and intelligent blue eyes. James Crawford looked like what he was, a career lawman who had seen enough of human nature to be perpetually cautious but not yet cynical. "Evening, Marshal," the clerk said. "Sorry to disturb you, but these folks have brought some information that I think you need to see right away." Crawford's eyes moved from the clerk to Gideon and Naeli, taking in their dusty clothes and armed status. "What kind of information?" "Evidence of territorial corruption involving stolen Apache land," Gideon said, "including forged documents and bribes reaching all the way to the governor's office. That's a serious accusation. You have proof." Gideon held up the journal. "Names, dates, amounts, and specific details about the conspiracy. But I should warn you, Judge Crane has issued federal warrants for our arrest. They're trying to discredit us before we can present our evidence." Crawford stepped back and gestured for them to enter. "Come in, let's see what you've got." The marshal's living room was comfortable but spartanly furnished, with law books lining one wall and a large desk covered with official papers. Crawford indicated that they should sit while he examined the journal. For the next 20 minutes the room was silent except for the turning of pages and the occasional sharp intake of breath from Crawford as he read particularly damning entries. When he finally closed the journal, his expression was grim. "If this is authentic," he said slowly, "then we're looking at the largest corruption scandal in territorial history. It's authentic, Naeli said. I witnessed the original hiding place myself. Crawford studied her carefully. You're the Apache woman mentioned in the warrants, Naeli Whitehawk, granddaughter of Chief Whitehawk. I am. The warrants claim you murdered 3 federal marshals and kidnapped this man against his will. The warrants are lies, Gideon interjected. She saved my life, and I went with her willingly after discovering the truth about what's been happening. And what exactly has been happening in your view? For the next hour, Gideon and Naeli took turns explaining the entire conspiracy as they understood it. Crawford listened carefully, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. The federal marshal's questions were sharp and probing, clearly designed to test the consistency of their story. This Fletcher Knox you mentioned, Crawford said finally. I know him by reputation. He's territorial marshal for the Northern District appointed by Governor Webb himself. Which explains how he had access to federal warrants and cavalry support, Gideon said. It also explains why he felt confident enough to try to bribe you in the first place. If the governor is part of this conspiracy, Knox would have believed himself untouchable. Crawford stood and walked to his window, looking out into the dark street. The problem is, even if everything you've told me is true, my jurisdiction is limited. I can investigate federal crimes, but most of what you're describing involves territorial officials acting under territorial authority. But the forged federal documents give you jurisdiction, don't they? Naeli asked, and the use of federal marshals and cavalry to cover up the conspiracy. Possibly, but I'll need more than this journal to build a case that will stand up in federal court. I'll need witnesses, additional documentation, maybe even confessions from some of the participants. Gideon felt his heart sink. How long would that take? Months, maybe years. Federal investigations move slowly, especially when they involve high-ranking territorial officials. We don't have months, Naeli said urgently. According to the journal, the final land transfers are scheduled to happen within the next few days. Once those documents are filed, the theft will be legally complete. Crawford returned to his chair, his expression troubled. There might be a way to stop the immediate transfers while we investigate the larger conspiracy. How? Federal injunctions. If I can convince a federal judge that the territorial land transfers are based on fraudulent documents, we can halt the process until a proper investigation is completed. Can you do that? Gideon asked. Judge Morrison is here in Tucson for the territorial court session. He's a federal appointee, so he has the authority to issue such an injunction. The question is whether he'll be willing to act on this evidence. What do you think? Crawford was quiet for a moment, weighing his words carefully. Judge Morrison is honest, but he's also cautious. He won't want to interfere with territorial business unless he's absolutely convinced that federal law is being violated. Then we need to convince him, Naeli said. It's not that simple. Morrison is also a political appointee, which means he has to consider the implications of his decisions for his own career. Halting a major territorial land deal based on accusations against the governor and other high-ranking officials, that's the kind of decision that can end a federal judge's career if it turns out to be wrong. The implications were clear. Even if they had reached an honest federal official, political considerations might still prevent justice from being done. What if we could get additional evidence? Gideon asked. Something beyond the journal. What kind of additional evidence? Confessions from participants, or maybe access to the original documents that were forged? Crawford shook his head. Too dangerous. If this conspiracy is as widespread as you believe, then attempting to gather additional evidence would likely get you killed before you could present it to a judge. Then what do you suggest? I suggest we present what we have to Judge Morrison first thing in the morning and hope that he's willing to act on it. In the meantime, you both need to stay out of sight. If Knox and his men are in Tucson looking for you, are they? Naeli asked. Crawford nodded grimly. 3 territorial marshals arrived this afternoon with orders to search the town. They've been questioning hotel clerks, stable owners, anyone who might have seen you. Where can we hide until morning? There's a safe house the federal marshals use for witnesses in sensitive cases. It's not much, but it's secure and unknown to territorial authorities. Before Crawford could provide directions, a sharp knock sounded at his front door. All 4 occupants of the room froze, listening as the knocking was repeated more insistently. "Marshal Crawford," a voice called from outside. "Federal business, open up." Crawford moved quickly to the window and peered through the curtains. 3 men, territorial marshals' badges, but I don't recognize them from the local office. "Knox's men," Gideon said grimly. "Back door," Crawford whispered urgently. "I'll try to delay them." Gideon and Naeli grabbed their weapons and moved toward the rear of the house as Crawford walked to the front door. They could hear him speaking through the closed door, asking for identification and the nature of their business. "We're looking for fugitives," one of the marshals replied. "Federal warrants issued this afternoon by Judge Crane. Have you seen anything suspicious tonight?" "I just got home from dinner," Crawford replied. "What kind of fugitives?" As the conversation continued, Gideon and Naeli slipped out the back door into Crawford's small garden. The stable was only 20 yards away, but those yards were completely exposed to anyone watching from the street. "The horses," Naeli whispered. "We need our horses." They crept along the side of the house toward the front, where their exhausted mounts were still tied to the hitching post. But as they peered around the corner, they could see one of the marshals examining the animals with obvious interest. "These horses have been ridden hard," the marshal called to his companions. "Recent arrival, I'd say." "Check the brands," another voice replied. Gideon's heart sank as he realized their escape route was compromised. The marshals would recognize the horses as belonging to the fugitives they were seeking, and Crawford would be implicated in harboring federal fugitives. "We have to help him," Naeli whispered. "How if we show ourselves? We're all dead." "If we don't, Crawford will be arrested as an accomplice. Then who will help us reach Judge Morrison?" She was right, but the odds were overwhelmingly against them. 3 armed marshals against 2 exhausted fugitives with no element of surprise was not a fight they were likely to win. That's when they heard Crawford's voice rise in apparent anger from inside the house. "I don't care what your warrants say," he was telling the marshals. "This is my home and you have no authority to search it without a federal judge's permission." "We have reason to believe you're harboring federal fugitives," one of the marshals replied. "Based on what evidence? Some tired horses tied to a public hitching post. Half the horses in Tucson show signs of hard riding." The argument was giving them time, but it wouldn't last long. Soon the marshals would either force their way into the house or post guards to prevent anyone from escaping. "There," Naeli whispered, pointing to a narrow alley between Crawford's house and the building next door. "We can reach the stable from the other side." They crawled along the alley using the darkness and their own exhaustion-born desperation to move silently through the shadows. The stable's back entrance was unlocked and they slipped inside among the horses and equipment. From their hiding place, they could hear the conversation at Crawford's front door growing more heated. The territorial marshals were becoming impatient with his refusal to cooperate, and it was only a matter of time before they decided to search the property by force. "We need a distraction," Gideon whispered. "What kind of distraction?" Before he could answer, the sound of gunfire erupted from the street outside. Not the measured shots of a gunfight, but the rapid, sustained firing of multiple weapons engaged in serious combat. "What the hell?" one of the marshals shouted. More gunfire followed, accompanied by shouting and the sound of running horses. Whatever was happening, it was large enough and serious enough to draw the attention of every law enforcement officer in the vicinity. "Apache attack on the north side of town," someone yelled from the street. "All federal marshals to the courthouse." The territorial marshals outside Crawford's house hesitated for only a moment before abandoning their search and running toward their horses. Within seconds, the sound of galloping hooves was fading into the distance as they raced toward the supposed Apache attack. Crawford appeared at the stable door moments later, his face grim in the moonlight. "That's not an Apache attack," he said. "That's your grandfather's warriors creating a distraction." Nayeli's eyes widened with understanding. "The war party followed us to Tucson, and now they're giving you a chance to escape. But it won't last long. Once the territorial marshals realize they've been deceived, they'll be back here in force." "Where's the safe house you mentioned?" Gideon asked. "Too far to reach on foot, and your horses are too recognizable now, but there's another option." Crawford led them back toward his house, moving quickly but cautiously. "Judge Morrison is staying at the Territorial Hotel while the court is in session. If we can reach him tonight before Knox's men regroup, we might be able to convince him to issue an emergency injunction." "How do we get to the hotel without being seen?" "The same way the Apache got close enough to create that distraction. We use the rooftops." Tucson's adobe buildings were built close together with flat roofs that formed a nearly continuous pathway across several blocks of the town. It was dangerous. A misstep could send them plummeting to the street below, but it offered the possibility of moving unseen through a town that was rapidly filling with searchers. Crawford led them up a ladder to his own roof, then across a series of increasingly treacherous leaps and climbs toward the center of town. The sounds of gunfire continued from the north side of Tucson, where Whitehawk's warriors were apparently conducting a masterful deception campaign. "There," Crawford said, finally pointing to a 3-story building that rose above the surrounding structures. "The Territorial Hotel. Morrison has the corner suite on the 3rd floor." Getting into the hotel unseen required lowering themselves down the side of the building to a 2nd-story balcony, then climbing through what they hoped was an unlocked window. Fortunately, the desert heat made most residents keep their windows open for ventilation. They found themselves in an empty guest room, but voices from the hallway indicated that other residents had been awakened by the gunfire and were discussing the supposed Apache attack in excited whispers. "Room 36, Crawford said, consulting a small notebook. "Morrison always takes the same suite when he's in Tucson." They crept down the hallway, avoiding other guests and hotel staff, who were too distracted by the commotion outside to pay attention to 3 figures moving quietly through the shadows. Judge Morrison's door was locked, but Crawford produced a small tool from his pocket and had it open within seconds. "Federal Marshal's skills," he explained quietly. Judge Morrison was a small, thin man in his 60s, with sparse gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that made him look more like a clerk than one of the most powerful federal officials in the territory. He woke with a start as they entered his room, reaching for a small pistol he kept on his nightstand. "Don't move," Crawford said, showing his federal marshal's badge. "James Crawford, federal marshal for the Southern District. I apologize for the intrusion, Your Honor, but we have an emergency that requires your immediate attention." Morrison blinked several times, trying to process what was happening. "Crawford, what's the meaning of this evidence of territorial corruption that threatens to invalidate federal land treaties with the Apache Nation? We need an emergency injunction to prevent fraudulent land transfers scheduled for tomorrow." Morrison put on his spectacles and looked at his unexpected visitors more carefully. "Is this connected to the Apache attack that's happening outside?" "There is no Apache attack," Nayeli said, speaking for the first time. "That's a distraction created to give us time to reach you with this evidence." Morrison's eyes fixed on her Apache features, and his expression grew wary. "You're the woman mentioned in the federal warrants that came through this afternoon." "The warrants are fraudulent," Gideon said urgently, "issued by corrupt territorial officials to prevent us from exposing their conspiracy." "That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof?" Crawford handed over the journal. "Names, dates, amounts, and specific details about bribes and forged documents. If even half of this is true, we're looking at the systematic theft of millions of acres of Apache land." Morrison examined the journal carefully, his expression growing more troubled with each page. When he finally looked up, his face was pale. "If this is authentic, It is, Naeli said firmly. Then we have a constitutional crisis on our hands. The territorial government appears to be operating as a criminal enterprise. The sounds of gunfire from outside were beginning to diminish, suggesting that Whitehawk's distraction was coming to an end. Soon Knox's men would realize they had been deceived and would resume their search for the fugitives. Your Honor, Crawford said urgently, we need that injunction tonight. Once word reaches the territorial capital that federal authorities are investigating, any remaining evidence will disappear and the participants will scatter. Morrison stood and walked to his window, looking out over the town where small fires were still burning from the Apache diversion. An injunction based on this evidence would effectively accuse the territorial governor of criminal conspiracy. That's not a decision I can make lightly. What if you're wrong? Gideon asked. What if you do nothing and this conspiracy succeeds? How many Apache families will lose their homes? How many children will go hungry because their land was stolen through forged documents? Morrison was quiet for a long moment, weighing the political and legal implications of his decision. Finally, he turned back to face them. I'll issue a temporary restraining order, halting all territorial land transfers involving Apache reservation property until a federal investigation can be completed. But I warn you, if this evidence turns out to be fabricated, all of you will face federal charges for fraud and conspiracy. Understood, Crawford said. Morrison sat at his writing desk and began drafting the injunction in careful legal language. Outside, the sounds of pursuit were growing closer as territorial marshals realized they had been duped and began searching the hotel district. There, Morrison said, finally signing the document with a flourish. A federal injunction halting all Apache land transfers pending investigation. Crawford, I'm deputizing you to serve this on territorial officials immediately. Yes, Your Honor. And I'm placing these two individuals in federal protective custody pending the completion of our investigation. Whatever their legal status under territorial warrants, they're now federal witnesses and under my jurisdiction. The relief that washed over Gideon was overwhelming. They had done it, reached federal authority, presented their evidence, and secured protection from Knox's pursuit. But even as he felt the weight of fear lifting from his shoulders, he knew the battle was far from over. Outside, the sound of boots on stairs indicated that their pursuers had reached the hotel and were beginning a room-by-room search. The war for Arizona territory had officially begun, and the opening shots had been fired not with bullets, but with legal documents and federal jurisdiction. The 12-cent cabin and the woman who had hung dying at its gate had started something that would reshape the entire territorial government if they could survive long enough to see it through. The boots on the hotel stairs grew louder, accompanied by harsh voices, demanding that guests open their doors for inspection. Judge Morrison moved quickly to his window and signaled with his lamp 3 short flashes followed by 2 long ones. Within moments, an answering signal came from across the street. Federal marshals, Morrison explained quietly. I sent word when I saw the territorial men approaching. You'll have an escort to the federal courthouse. Crawford checked his weapon and moved to the door. How many men do you have available? 6 deputies plus 2 federal agents who arrived from Phoenix yesterday. Should be enough to get us there safely. The sound of splintering wood came from down the hallway as Knox's men began forcing their way into locked rooms. Angry shouts and protests from awakened hotel guests filled the air, but the territorial marshals were beyond caring about civilian complaints. Room 36, someone bellowed. That's where Crawford went. Time to go, Morrison said, grabbing a coat and his official papers. There's a service stairway at the back of the building. They moved quickly through Morrison's suite toward a door that opened onto the hotel's rear staircase. As they descended, the sounds of confrontation erupted from the 3rd floor as Knox's men discovered the federal marshals waiting for them. Federal jurisdiction, Crawford's deputy was shouting. Stand down immediately. We have territorial warrants, Knox's voice replied, filled with fury. Those fugitives are coming with us. Not without a federal court order, they're not. The standoff gave them precious seconds to reach the ground floor and slip out the hotel's back entrance. In the alley behind the building, 6 mounted federal deputies waited with extra horses, their rifles ready and their faces grim in the moonlight. Trouble, one of them asked Crawford. The territorial government appears to be in open rebellion against federal authority, Crawford replied, helping Nayeli onto one of the horses. We need to get these witnesses to the courthouse before this turns into a shooting war. As if his words had been prophetic, gunfire erupted from inside the hotel. The territorial marshals and federal deputies had apparently decided that words were insufficient to resolve their jurisdictional dispute. "Move!" Crawford shouted. They galloped through Tucson's back streets as the gunfight continued behind them. The federal courthouse loomed ahead like a fortress, its stone walls and barred windows designed to withstand exactly this kind of assault on federal authority. Judge Morrison dismounted at the courthouse steps and immediately began issuing orders to the federal deputies. Secure the building. No one enters without federal authorization. And send word to Fort Lowell we may need military support if this situation escalates. Inside, the courthouse oil lamps were hastily lit as clerks and deputies prepared for what might be a siege. The building had been designed with defense in mind, with thick walls and strategically placed windows that could serve as firing positions if necessary. "Your Honor," Crawford said, as they gathered in Morrison's chambers, "what's our legal standing here? Can territorial officials legally challenge federal jurisdiction?" "Under normal circumstances, no," Morrison replied, settling behind his desk, with the journal still in his hands. "But if Governor Webb claims that federal officials are exceeding their authority based on fabricated evidence, he could declare martial law." Gideon finished understanding the implications. "Turn this into a territorial rebellion against federal authority." "Exactly. And if that happens, we'll need more than a few federal deputies to maintain order." Nayeli moved to the window, peering out at the street where torches were beginning to appear as word of the confrontation spread through Tucson. "How long before Knox brings reinforcements?" "Depends on how many men he can trust with the truth," Crawford said. "If this conspiracy involves as many officials as that journal suggests, he might have access to the entire territorial militia." "Then we need to move faster than they do," Morrison decided. "Crawford, I want you to ride to Fort Lowell immediately. Inform Colonel Hayes that federal law is being challenged by territorial authorities and request military support." "What about the injunction? I'll serve it myself with federal deputies as witnesses. If Governor Webb wants to challenge federal authority, he'll have to do it in person." The plan was bold to the point of recklessness. Judge Morrison was preparing to ride directly into the territorial capital and confront Governor Webb with evidence of his corruption backed by nothing more than federal law and a handful of deputies. "Your Honor," Gideon said, "that's suicide. If Webb is as corrupt as we believe, he won't hesitate to have you killed rather than face federal prosecution." "Perhaps. But if federal judges run from corrupt territorial officials, then we might as well hand the entire territory over to criminals and thieves." The conviction in Morrison's voice was absolute. Whatever fears he might have about the personal consequences of his decision, his commitment to federal law was unshakable. "I'm going with you," Nayeli announced. "Absolutely not," Morrison replied. "You're a federal witness now, and your safety is my responsibility. My grandfather's warriors are still out there somewhere. If shooting starts, you'll need Apache allies more than you'll need federal procedure." "She's right," Crawford said reluctantly. "If this turns into open warfare, the Apache could tip the balance in favor of federal authority." Morrison was quiet for a moment, weighing the risks against the potential benefits. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well. But you stay close to my deputies and follow their orders without question." As they prepared to leave for the territorial capital, word arrived that Knox's reinforcements were already mobilizing. A federal scout reported seeing territorial militia units moving toward Tucson from 3 different directions, their numbers estimated at over 200 men. "How long do we have?" Morrison asked. 6 hours, maybe 8 if they're moving cautiously, the scout replied. "Enough time to reach Prescott and serve the injunction before they can organize effective resistance." But even as Morrison spoke with confidence, everyone in the room understood the mathematics of their situation. They were riding into the heart of a corrupt territorial government with evidence that could destroy careers and send powerful men to prison. The opposition would be desperate, well-armed, and fighting for their very survival. As dawn broke over the Arizona mountains, Judge Morrison's small party rode out of Tucson toward the territorial capital. The group consisted of Morrison himself, 6 federal deputies, Gideon and Nayeli, plus 2 Apache scouts who had materialized out of the desert to serve as guides and messengers. The ride to Prescott normally took 2 days, but Morrison pushed the pace mercilessly, changing horses at federal way stations and sleeping only when the animals needed rest. As they traveled, more Apache warriors appeared along their route, not threatening but clearly watching and waiting for some signal from Nayeli. "How many warriors does your grandfather have in this area?" Morrison asked during one of their brief rest stops. "Enough," Nayeli replied cryptically. "The Apache nation has not forgotten how to defend itself, even when the enemy wears badges and claims legal authority." The implications were clear. If the territorial government chose to resist federal authority with force, they would find themselves fighting not just federal marshals, but also Apache warriors defending their ancestral lands. As they approached Prescott late on the second day, smoke was visible rising from the town, not the normal cook fires and industrial activity of a territorial capital, but the thick black smoke that spoke of burning buildings and conflict. "What's happening?" one of the deputies asked. The answer came from an Apache scout who rode up to their party with urgent news, delivered in rapid, excited words that Nayeli translated. "Governor Webb has declared martial law," she said, her face pale. "He's claiming that Apache raiders are threatening the territorial government and has called out the militia to defend against federal interference in territorial security." "Federal interference?" Morrison's voice was tight with anger. "We're serving a lawful federal injunction based on evidence of criminal conspiracy." He's turned the whole thing around, Gideon realized. Made us look like the aggressors and himself, the victim of federal overreach. As they crested the final hill before Prescott, the full scope of Webb's preparations became visible. The territorial capital had been turned into an armed camp, with militia units positioned at every approach and artillery pieces commanding the main roads. Confederate flags flew alongside territorial banners, a not-so-subtle reminder that many of Webb's supporters had fought against federal authority before. "He's prepared for war," one of the deputies observed grimly. "Then war is what he'll get," Morrison replied, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. They approached the town under a flag of truce, but the militia units that surrounded them made it clear that federal authority was no longer recognized in the territorial capital. When they reached the governor's mansion, they found it surrounded by armed guards and fortified like a military command post. Governor Marcus Webb emerged to meet them personally, flanked by Judge Crane and Commissioner Ross, the very men named in the conspiracy journal. Webb was a tall, distinguished man with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that made him a natural politician. But his eyes were cold and calculating as he studied Morrison's small party. "Judge Morrison," Webb said with false courtesy, "what brings federal authority to our territorial capital in such interesting company?" He gestured toward Nayeli and the Apache scouts, his meaning unmistakable. By traveling with Apache warriors, Morrison had appeared to validate Webb's claims about federal collusion with hostile Indians. "I'm here to serve a federal injunction halting all Apache land transfers pending investigation of territorial corruption," Morrison replied, producing the legal document. Webb barely glanced at the injunction before handing it to Judge Crane. "William, what's your assessment of this federal overreach?" Crane examined the document with theatrical thoroughness before shaking his head. "Completely without merit, Governor. Federal courts have no jurisdiction over territorial land management, and this entire proceeding appears to be based on fabricated evidence provided by known Apache conspirators." "Fabricated evidence?" Morrison's voice rose with indignation. "The journal contains detailed records of bribes and forged documents written in your own handwriting." "Journal?" Webb asked with feigned confusion. "I'm not aware of any journal. Are you Judge Crane?" "No journal has been presented as evidence in any territorial court," Crane replied smoothly, "and without proper authentication through territorial legal procedures, any such document would be inadmissible." Gideon stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "You lying bastards! You know exactly what that journal contains because you wrote half of it yourselves." "Easy," Morrison warned, but his own anger was becoming visible. Webb smiled coldly. "Ah, the federal fugitive speaks. Tell me, Mr. Hale, how much did the Apache pay you to fabricate evidence against the territorial government?" "Nobody paid me anything. I'm here because I saw Nayeli hanging from that gate and decided that justice was more important than my own safety." "How noble. And I suppose the Apache woman's grandfather had nothing to do with your sudden conversion to their cause." The verbal sparring was interrupted by the arrival of more militia units, their numbers clearly designed to intimidate Morrison's small federal party. Soon they were surrounded by over 100 armed men, all wearing territorial badges and flying Confederate battle flags. Governor Morrison said formally, "I'm serving this injunction under federal authority. Your compliance is not optional." "Judge Morrison," Webb replied with equal formality, "I'm declaring this injunction invalid under territorial sovereignty and ordering you to leave our capital immediately. Your continued presence here constitutes federal interference in territorial affairs. And if I refuse, then you'll be arrested for trespassing conspiracy with hostile Indians and attempting to undermine territorial security during a time of declared emergency." The standoff was complete. Federal authority faced territorial rebellion, with both sides claiming legal justification for their actions. The situation was exactly what the framers of the Constitution had tried to prevent when they created a federal system with clearly defined jurisdictions. But clarity meant nothing when one side was willing to ignore the law entirely. "Your Honor," one of Morrison's deputies whispered urgently, "we're outnumbered 20-1. Maybe we should withdraw and request military support." Morrison's jaw was set in determination. "Federal law doesn't retreat from territorial corruption, Deputy. If Governor Webb wants to start a constitutional crisis, then so be it." He raised his voice so that everyone present could hear. "By the authority vested in me as a federal judge, I hereby order the immediate cessation of all Apache land transfers as specified in this injunction. Any territorial official who violates this order will be subject to federal prosecution for conspiracy and civil rights violations." Webb's response was swift and decisive. "Arrest them all. The federal judge for exceeding his authority, the deputies for armed trespass, and the Apache conspirators for terrorism and sedition." As the militia moved forward to carry out Webb's orders, the sound of war cries echoed from the hills surrounding Prescott. Chief Whitehawk had apparently decided that words were no longer sufficient to resolve the crisis. Apache warriors appeared on the ridges around the town, their numbers impossible to count but clearly substantial. The territorial militia found themselves caught between their duty to arrest federal officials and their instinct to defend against what appeared to be an imminent Indian attack. "Grandfather," Nayeli called out in Apache, her voice carrying clearly across the valley. An answering call came from the hills, followed by the distinctive whistle that Apache warriors use to coordinate their movements. Within moments, the sound was echoed from multiple positions around Prescott, creating the impression of a vast war party preparing for battle. "Stand down your warriors," Webb demanded, "or this town will be reduced to ashes." "Stand down your militia," Morrison countered, "or face the consequences of armed rebellion against federal authority." The confrontation had reached its climax, with both sides poised for violence that could engulf the entire territory. But before shots could be fired, a new voice entered the standoff. "That will be quite enough." Everyone turned to see a small, elderly man approaching on horseback, flanked by a company of blue-uniformed cavalry. Colonel Hayes from Fort Lowell had arrived with federal troops, transforming the balance of power in an instant. "Governor Webb," Colonel Hayes said formally, "you are in violation of federal law and under arrest for conspiracy against the United States government." "Colonel, you're exceeding your authority," Webb replied, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "This is a territorial matter." "Not anymore. When territorial officials declare martial law to resist federal court orders, it becomes a military matter under federal jurisdiction." The colonel's troops spread out in professional formation, their rifles ready, but not yet aimed. Unlike the territorial militia, these were trained soldiers who knew how to project strength without creating unnecessary provocation. "Judge Morrison," Hayes continued, "my orders are to provide whatever support is necessary to enforce federal law in this territory." Morrison stepped forward, his relief evident, despite his attempt to maintain judicial dignity. "Colonel, I need you to arrest Governor Webb, Judge Crane, and Commissioner Ross on federal conspiracy charges, and I need your troops to secure all territorial offices pending a complete investigation." "Consider it done, Your Honor." As federal troops moved to make arrests, the territorial militia found themselves facing an impossible choice. They could resist federal authority and potentially face court-martial for treason, or they could stand down and abandon the officials who had led them into this confrontation. Most chose to stand down. Within an hour, the key figures in the territorial conspiracy were in federal custody, and their supporters had melted away like morning fog before the desert sun. But the most dramatic moment came when Chief Whitehawk himself rode down from the hills to meet with Judge Morrison. The old Apache leader dismounted and approached the federal judge with the dignity of one sovereign addressing another. "Judge Morrison," Whitehawk said in carefully pronounced English, "my granddaughter tells me that you have acted with honor in this matter. I've tried to uphold federal law and protect the rights of all citizens, Chief Whitehawk. And what of the Apache land that was stolen through false papers? Will your federal law return what was taken?" Morrison looked at the journal that had started everything, then at Gideon and Nayeli, who had risked their lives to expose the truth. "Chief Whitehawk, I give you my word that every acre stolen through forged documents will be returned to your people, and those responsible will face the full weight of federal justice." The old chief nodded slowly. "Then perhaps there is hope for justice between our peoples after all." As the sun set over Prescott, painting the territorial capital in shades of gold and crimson, Gideon found himself standing with Nayeli at the edge of town, watching as federal troops escorted the corrupt officials toward their cells. "It's over," he said, hardly able to believe it himself. "This part is over," Nayeli corrected, "but the real work is just beginning. Returning stolen land, rebuilding trust between our peoples, making sure this never happens again, that will take years. Will you help with that work?" She smiled, the first genuinely happy expression he'd seen on her face since he'd cut her down from that gate. Someone has to make sure the white man keeps his promises this time. "And what about us? I mean, after everything we've been through together." "Gideon Hail," she said, her voice warm with affection. You bought a cabin for 12 cents and found more than you bargained for. Are you ready for whatever comes next? He thought about the question seriously. 3 days ago, he'd been a broken man with nothing left to lose. Now he was part of something larger than himself, a fight for justice that had reshaped an entire territory and given him a reason to live again. "I'm ready," he said finally, as they walked back toward town where federal marshals were already beginning the long process of investigating the conspiracy and rebuilding territorial government on honest foundations. Gideon couldn't help but think about the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A 12-cent land purchase, a woman left hanging to die, a journal hidden beneath floorboards, a desperate ride through the desert with Apache warriors, a confrontation that nearly sparked a territorial war, and at the end of it all, justice. Imperfect, incomplete, but real, nonetheless. The cabin was gone, burned to the ground in that first night's fighting, but at the gate where Nayeli had once hung, dying Chief Whitehawk's warriors had erected a new sign painted in both Apache and English, "Freedom." It wasn't much to show for 12 cents and nearly dying half a dozen times, but as Gideon looked at Nayeli walking beside him and thought about the Apache families who would keep their land because of what they'd accomplished, he decided it was the best investment he'd ever made. The war for Arizona territory was over. The war for justice was just beginning. And for the first time since Sarah's death, Gideon Hail was exactly where he belonged.